On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Anya Manuel, your moderator for tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest for a very timely discussion on Iran. Dr. Kenneth Pollack is a senior fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Previously, he served on the staff of the National Security Council. He was also the Director for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And Dr. Pollack began his career as an Iran-Iraq military analyst at the CIA. So he's seen government from multiple perspectives and now from a more academic perspective. And his most recent book, which is excellent, I have started reading it last night. It's called Unthinkable, Iran, the Bomb, and American Strategy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pollack for a discussion of Iran.
Thank you so much, Anya, for that very kind introduction. Thank all of you. It's wonderful to be back here. It's been some time since last I was here, but I've always enjoyed when I'm able to come out here. I can't think of a better day to be talking about this particular topic. Been a remarkable few weeks. Today was a bit of an anticlimax for me, but I think you're all aware that we did have some remarkable things happen today in New York at the United Nations General Assembly. First, President Obama spoke. And as part of his remarks, he did try to, I think somewhat tentatively, but nevertheless extend a hand to the Iranians and to say that he had heard what the Iranians had been saying over the last few weeks and that he was certainly interested in exploring a new relationship with the Iranians. Although, as I said, I felt that his remarks were kind of timid, not quite as courageous as I would have liked him to have been, given what the Iranians have done over the past few weeks. Then this afternoon, the new president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, spoke. Now, I will say that Rouhani's remarks were pretty boilerplate. They weren't much better than what President Obama had to say. But what we've seen from the Iranians in the last few weeks, I think, has been really remarkable. With Rouhani himself coming out on multiple occasions saying that he wanted to have a new relationship with the international community, with the West, with the United States, that he recognized that Iran's nuclear program had become an albatross around the necks of the Iranian people, and that the sanctions needed to be lifted, and that he was ready to talk about making compromises on Iran's nuclear program to try to have the sanctions lifted and to have that better relationship with the rest of the world. That in and of itself, I think, has been very important, very exciting, really interesting. Perhaps even more interesting was that he actually got an assist from Iran's supreme leader. And we should remember that Hassan Rouhani, as the president of Iran, isn't unimportant, but he's not the most important decision maker in Iran. The most important decision maker in Iran is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And in the past, what we've seen from Khamenei is he is deeply suspicious of the United States. And he has been one of the main impediments toward making any deal on the nuclear program. And he gave a fascinating interview, or a fascinating speech the other day to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, in which he called, only in Iran could you say this, but he called for heroic flexibility, which is kind of mind-boggling in an Iranian context. And it was clearly Khamenei saying, I am willing to at least explore the possibility of a deal. Okay, that to me is phenomenally exciting, because I think everyone in this room realizes that we have a very serious issue with the Iranians related to their nuclear program. Their nuclear program has been stirring up a lot of dissension within the Middle East, a great deal of turmoil. There are a lot of people who are afraid, I think rightfully so, that the introduction of an Iranian nuclear arsenal could further destabilize what is already the most unstable part of the entire planet. And I think that we should all recognize, I hope that we all do, that if we can find a way through diplomacy to turn off this program, to end that threat, there is no question it would be the absolute best thing for us, for our allies, for the Iranians. So we should all hope that this is actually going to work. Now, it's going to be difficult. There's no question about that. And again, I think that the timidity of both speeches today reflect the difficulties. Both countries have allies, both countries have domestic politics, and there are skeptics abounding on both sides. Okay? And skeptics for good reasons. On our side, we worry that the Iranians won't live up to the terms, that they'll cheat, exactly the way that the North Koreans did, the way that Saddam Hussein did before 1991, and as he tried to for a number of years after 1991. We're afraid that even leaving the Iranians some residual capability might be too dangerous, because at some point they might decide to exploit it and build an actual arsenal. And on the Iranian side, let's remember that the Iranians remember too well 1953, when we helped overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, the very popular Iranian prime minister. It's an event that looms very large in their psyches. And they, of course, can point to a number of other incidents when the United States has treated them as they saw it very unfairly. And I think in many cases they actually exaggerate or misinterpret what we did or what we may have done, but nevertheless for Iranians these are very real things. And they fear that the United States is determined to reduce them to third-rate status, that we are determined to overthrow their government and impose on them some new colonial form of government. And so for those reasons, they have been very skeptical about giving up this nuclear program, which has been a critical element of their sense of themselves, their prestige, even their identity over the years. So while it is clear that it would be best if we could forge this deal, I don't think that there's anyone who doesn't recognize that it may be very difficult to do. And in fact, it might actually be impossible. Now, I find that very disconcerting, not just because it would mean giving up what is clearly the best answer to this problem, but because there's a mindset that seems to have taken hold in Washington that I find very, very alarming. In Washington, the zeitgeist, the common wisdom right now is that we're going to give Rouhani one more chance to make a deal. And maybe that'll be 6 months, maybe a year, who knows, maybe 2 years. But we'll give him some limited period of time, not very long. And if he can't deliver, if Iran isn't willing to do what it is that we want them to do, we're going to go to war with Iran. Okay, that just seems to be what everyone in Washington believes. I find that very dangerous. I think many in this room know I'm not a shrinking violet. Okay? I believe that there is a place for the use of force in American foreign policy. I believe that there are times when the United States does have to use force. Okay? I'm no pacifist. But I also do ardently believe that we should only be using force if it is our last resort, and we should only be using force if the American people are committed to doing so. If we've had an honest conversation about what the use of force actually means, and the American people are ready to sign up for it and all that it implies. Because as we've learned from our very painful experiences in the last few decades, obviously most particularly with Iraq and Afghanistan, oftentimes when you start down the path of war, you don't end up in the place where you hope to be, where you intended to be when you first set out. And so if we're going to use force, again, I want us to have that conversation about what it all means, what the unintended consequences may be, so that if we sign up for it, we are ready to pay all of the costs that may come for it, not just the little costs that may come with the best case scenario. The problem with wars, this is the obvious lesson from Iraq, if you expect only the best case, oftentimes you will get the worst case. And the worst case costs a lot more than the best case. Okay. When I think about what we just went through with Syria, and I have to tell you that I've not been terribly pleased with how the administration handled the entire crisis with Syria. But for me, one of the worst facets of it was the way that the administration kept trying to define the problem as this narrow issue of the use of chemical warfare agents in Syria. And in some ways, I was quite heartened by the fact that the rest of the country, both left and right, for different reasons, kept coming back to the administration and saying, no, it's a much bigger issue. We want to have the conversation about the Syrian civil war, because we are concerned that if we start to use force for this narrow issue, we'll wind up getting roped into this much bigger issue. And we want to talk about that. Okay, I thought that was a very important thing for the American people to say. And it's exactly the conversation that I think we need to start having about Iran. Because as important as Syria was, as problematic as a war with Syria would be, it will pale in comparison with the problems that we will face with Iran. Okay? And just like Syria, we started out having this conversation. The administration wanted to have the conversation just about this narrow issue of what do we do about Syria's CW use, but looming behind it was this much larger issue of what do we do about the Syrian civil war itself, and do we want to get involved in that wider war, and do we want to take steps that could open us up to getting involved in that wider war. So too is that the case with Iran. If Rouhani proves to be everything that we hope he is, everything that I believe him to be, and he is also able to bring along Iran's hardliners, which is obviously going to be the greatest trick for him to do so, if he's able to do that, he's going to put a deal on the table, which I will tell you is probably going to be very good, but a lot of other people are going to be very fearful of. And fearful for good reason. It isn't going to be perfect. The Iranians are not going to give up all enrichment activity. Okay, they've made this clear over and over and over again. There is going to be some residual capability left over. Okay, and that means that there is going to be a lot of room for debate. Okay, but the problem is that I am very concerned that what we're going to do is we're going to have a debate about that specific deal. And what we're going to miss is the more important debate that lies behind it. The more important debate that lies behind it is what do we do if we don't take the deal? Or what do we do if Rouhani can't put the deal on the table? Because if that is the case, we're going to be facing two much worse choices. A choice between containing Iran, maybe even containing a nuclear Iran, or going to war to prevent Iran from acquiring that capability. Okay. And until you can answer that question, until we as a nation can come to an answer on that question, we can't really know whether or not we're going to want to take what is ultimately going to be a good but imperfect offer by Rouhani, again, assuming he's able to put it on the table. Okay? Because think about it this way. If you really are ready to go to war with Iran, then what actually Prime Minister Netanyahu said overnight is really what's going to matter for you, which is a bad deal would be worse than no deal. Whereas if you don't want to go to war with Iran, if you're ready to contain even a nuclear war, then you think about it in a completely different way, which is that almost any deal is better than no deal, because almost any deal gets you something that you otherwise don't have. And that's why this debate is actually critical. This larger debate is critical to what's hopefully going to happen over the next 6 or 12 or 18 months. Now, all of this is the topic of my new book. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I tried to write a book that I thought would be useful to pretty much any average American who's trying to come at this issue and trying to decide for himself or herself what we ought to be doing with Iran. So the book has three broad parts. The first part of it, I like to think, is the intel briefing. And as Anya described, I've had many different parts to my career. And so I tried to kind of weave those different pieces together. So the first part is just a kind of pure intel briefing. I talk about the Iranian regime, its politics, how it makes decisions, what we know, and mostly what we don't know, about how they think about their nuclear program, their goals, everything else that would matter to you. I talk about the nuclear program as best we understand it, based mostly on the inspections regime that the IAEA performs in Iran. And I talk about the threat that a nuclear Iran might create for American interests and for the Middle East. In the second part, I shift gears and I talk a little bit about the different policy options for preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And I spend a lot of time on this diplomatic option. I talk a lot about what the deal might look like with Iran, what Rouhani might be able to produce, what we might have to do to get that deal, and how we ought to think about it, under what circumstances might we want to take it. I also look at some of the other options. I look at regime change briefly. I also look at an Israeli military strike, which glad to talk about this more. Again, as Anya described, I'm an old military analyst. I would be delighted to talk with you all night long about an American or an Israeli military strike. We can get out maps and draw range rings and whatever you guys like. But just to kind of sum it up, I think that an Israeli military strike would be the worst of all possible options. Okay. They might be willing to do it, although I have my doubts even about that, but they're not the right ones to do it. They have a military option, but it's not a good military option. And then I turn and look at an American military operation against Iran, one that would probably start with airstrikes, but that could eventually end with a full-scale invasion. And I discuss it in great detail, and it's something that I've looked at in the past, and I look at it again, and I say, look, this is not a foolish option. Okay, there is real merit to this. There are many people who believe in it. They're not knaves, they're not fools, they're not charlatans to believe it. Okay, and there's actually a better argument to be made for force now than the last time I wrote on this issue, which was about 10 years ago. But when I look at the military option, to me, I see more and bigger costs and risks than with its alternative, with containment. I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just sketch out broadly some of the concerns that I have with the military option. And again, it's typically described as being about airstrikes. We would hit them for somewhere between 1 and 10 days, bomb their nuclear program back to the Stone Age, something I think that our Air Force and Navy are fully capable of doing. But as always, just like in Iraq, that's not really the issue for me. The real issue for me is what happens next. And what I worry about is two things. First, I worry that after we've gotten through pounding the rubble in Iran, the Iranians are going to stand up, dust themselves off, shake their fists at us, and announce that they are rebuilding their nuclear program, withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, throwing out the inspectors, and going to deploy a nuclear arsenal, which, by the way, is what they have consistently threatened to do. And it's what we've seen other regimes like this do. It's worth remembering. Saddam Hussein, both in 1981 and again in 1991, followed that exact same pattern. Okay? After the Israelis struck the Osirak reactor, Saddam's response was, boy, that was a bad idea. Maybe I ought to find something else to do. His response was, I got to go bigger. And instead, he sunk enormous amounts of Iraqi resources into a new nuclear program, and as a result, picked up huge steam, and by the time that he invaded Kuwait, he was probably just a year or two away from actually having a nuclear weapon. And the best scholarship on the Osirak strike now uniformly has concluded that the Osirak strike, if anything, sped up the Iraqi nuclear program rather than setting it back. And we should also remember that in 1991, after Desert Storm, after 42 days, after 188,000 sorties against Iraq, Saddam Hussein still was trying to hang on to his nuclear program. And I can remember, with the help, trying to help our inspectors chase these gigantic magnets that Saddam was using to to enrich uranium around the desert, because he was trying desperately to hide them from our inspectors. And again, the Iranians have consistently said, if anyone strikes us, this is what we're going to do. And my concern is, if that's what happens, the President of the United States is not going to be able to go on TV and say, well, we tried, didn't work, guess we're just going to have to learn to live with them. Okay. That's not how it works for a President of the United States. The other thing that I worry about is that the Iranians are almost certainly going to retaliate. Okay, and this is something fundamentally different from what we confronted in Syria. With Syria, there wasn't a real fear that the Syrians would or could retaliate, because the truth is they really can't. The Iranians can. The Iranians are quite good at terrorism, and they are very involved in it. We should always remember Richard Armitage, the former Deputy Secretary of State, who after 9/11 famously said, Al-Qaeda, they're the junior varsity. The varsity is Hezbollah and Iran. And we know that since 2011, since their botched attempt to try to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States in a restaurant that I have eaten at, which makes me very nervous, the Iranians realized that they had really allowed their assets in the United States to atrophy. And the U.S. intelligence community has reported on, it's now made into the newspapers, that the Iranians are rebuilding their capacity to strike here in the United States exactly in case the United States bombs them. Okay? And again, if we bomb them and the Iranians strike back here in the American homeland and they kill a bunch of Americans, I think it's going to be very hard for the President of the United States to stand up before the American people and say, in effect, what do you expect? We started it. I think there's going to be an enormous pressure on him to keep going. And I don't know about Anya, but I've participated in many crisis simulations, war games, both in government and out, where we've war gamed an American-Iranian war. And they go on and on and on. Okay? And nobody can ever figure out how to stop them, because the two sides just keep doing damage to each other. And I also think about the fact that that's effectively what happened in Iraq. And we should remember that after 1991, we lobbed cruise missiles at Saddam Hussein 3 times. Then we tried a 3-day bombing campaign. None of that worked. And so eventually we wound up invading. And I fear that we could get into the exact same spiral with the Iranians, okay, which is a much, much bigger problem than Iraq. Now, when I turn to containment, which is the obvious alternative, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll be honest with you. Containment to me is not a perfect policy. Okay? Containment leaves a lot to be desired. In my mind, it's simply the least bad option. In my mind, I add up the costs and risks and say, containment, not a great policy. Boy, I wish we don't have to go down that road. But to me, better than the costs and risks involved in war. And yes, there are absolute problems with containment. We're glad to talk about them if you want to in the Q&A. But what's striking to me is I work through all of the problems in containment, and I spend some time trying to honestly work through each one of the different problems that either others have raised or that I see as a result both of our own efforts with Iran and of other containment regimes that the United States has employed during basically during the last 100 years. What I see is a series of problems that, though difficult, are not impossible to manage, all of which have solutions, some easier, some harder, but they're all there. And I look at them and say, for that reason, because it does seem entirely plausible to contain even a nuclear Iran, if it came to that, force really should be the last resort, and we do have an alternative to it. And I'll just point out that, we don't think about how many countries we've contained over the years. Obviously, we all know about the Soviet Union, which, let's remember, the Soviet Union was infinitely bigger, infinitely more powerful than Iran. Okay? But we've contained Cuba, North Korea, Nicaragua, Saddam's Iraq, Libya, Iran itself since the Islamic Revolution. And what's amazing is we've actually done a really good job. We're actually quite good at containment. And when you think even of the nuclear ingredient being added, it's worth keeping in mind, a lot of people were incredibly frightened of North Korea. One of the biggest fears that people have about the idea of containing a nuclear Iran is the idea that Iran would have nuclear weapons. And there are many people who believe the Iranians are insane and that they might use these things. Okay? What I do in this book is I go through the history of Iranian decision-making and demonstrate that, in actuality, the Iranian regime is not a bunch of nice people. Okay, let's not mistake them for kind of misunderstood Methodists. Okay, they're a nasty group. They're murderous. They're anti-American. They're anti-status quo. They are, huge supporters of terrorism. But they're not irrational. They're not reckless. They're not imprudent. They understand deterrence. What we've consistently seen from the Iranians is that they try to figure out where our red lines are. They go right up to the edge. And if they step over, they pull back immediately. In my mind, very different pattern of behavior than someone like Saddam Hussein, who didn't know where the red lines were, didn't really care, kind of wandered past them, blew by them, pretended that they weren't there, told us that they shouldn't be there, and wound up eventually not only ignoring deterrence any number of times, but immolating his own regime and himself. Okay? The Iranians are very different decision makers. And again, I think the historical evidence is really striking. We all worry about when different regimes get a nuclear weapon. For me, the scariest regime with a nuclear weapon, not the possibility of Iran, it's North Korea. Okay? To me, North Korea, makes Iran look like Canada. Looks boring and open. The Iranians are easy compared to North Korea. Okay? But by anybody's guess, the North Koreans have had a nuclear weapon for 17 years. Okay, and I believe it would be much better if they didn't have those weapons. And I would love to get those weapons away from the North Koreans. But it's very striking to me that we've not seen even the North Koreans do something reckless and foolish with those weapons. And again, the history of Iranian behavior is fundamentally different from that of North Korea. So that's kind of where I come out, and there's obviously a great deal more to it. But what I'll say again is that I really wrote this book to try to help everybody make their own decision about Iran. I invite you to read it. I think that you will find everything that you need in it, either to agree with me or to disagree with me. And if you disagree with me, I'm good with that. Okay? What I most want is just for everybody to actually be thinking about this and to be asking themselves and each other and our leaders, what is the best course? And to be talking about it openly. Because what I worry about most is that we are going to simply fall into a policy for lack of thought. And what I see in Washington is this conception that, well, we're just going to do war because no one is willing to think about containment. Nobody is willing to say this might be the better approach. Nobody's willing to actually stand up and say, look, here's why I think this and not that. We're just kind of assuming that this is what we're going to do because we're not talking about it. And from my own perspective, when we're thinking about the possibility of a nuclear Iran, no policy should be unthinkable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. That was an excellent summary. We have a lot of questions from the audience, as you might predict. And let me start. We've been talking a lot about options in Iran. Let me back you up first. And in the beginning of your book, you have this great section, what you call the intel briefing on Iran. And there's a great description of the different parts of the Iranian regime and where the power resides. Could you maybe give us just a short summary of that? How does Rouhani fit into the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, et cetera?
Sure. We're going to order in for pizza?
We will.
Okay. Well, let me start by making a point that I make in the book, which I think is always important to think about when we talk about the Iranian regime and what we know about it, which is, and I know I'm giving away kind of a trade secret here. So, if any of my colleagues are in the audience, any of the other Iran experts are in the audience, you'll please forgive me for doing this, but I'm going to tell our little secret. Our little secret is this. If you want to be an Iran expert, it's really, really easy, okay? Because you only need to know two phrases, all right? Ready? Here are the two phrases. I don't know, and it depends, okay? Because those are the answers to every single question that you will get asked about Iran. So, Anya, that's a wonderful question. I don't know, and it depends. Here's what I mean by that. Iran is an incredibly complex political system. Many Iran experts, I think many political scientists would argue that it may be one of the most fragmented polities in the world. You have all kinds of competing power centers and different groups. Sitting at the, I don't know if you want to call it the peak or maybe the center, maybe thinking about it as a spider's web is a better way to think about it, with right in the center is the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Now, what's important to understand about Khamenei is a very weak man in a very strong position. Okay? And around Khamenei are a whole variety of different power centers, groups like the Revolutionary Guards, or the regular army, or the judiciary, or different groups within Iran's parliament, the Majlis, and then a whole variety of individuals who have power of their own that kind of transcend different institutions. So somebody like former President Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani is another one who might fall into that category, who is powerful because of who he is, not necessarily what position he happens to occupy. And then there are a whole bunch of other people out there who we know their name, but we're never quite certain what they do or how powerful they are. But what we know about the supreme leader is he's one of these guys who relies very heavily on personal relationships. And so as a result, he talks to lots of different people, and he tends to make decisions based on different things that different people told him. The problem is we never know who he spoke to, who he listened to, and what he did in response to it. Okay? And the worst part about it for us is that what you find with Khamenei, and this goes back to my point about him being a weak man in a strong position, Khamenei is one of these guys who doesn't really seem to like to take hard decisions and to decide, you're going to get this and you're going to get nothing. Instead, what he likes to do is he gives half a loaf to this group and half a loaf to that group and half a loaf to this other group and half a loaf to the guys over here and half a loaf to this. And I know I've just handed out 5 halves of a loaf, okay? But that's the problem. That's what Khamenei does. And he then kind of leaves it up to all of them to kind of figure out what they actually are holding in their hands. And a lot of it gets sorted out in that way. And so it makes for a very complex system. It makes for a system that's very hard to predict. I often like to say that, if we could somehow, have Ali Akbar, Hashemi Rafsanjani, or Yazdi, or one of these other great old men of the revolution kind of sitting in that chair, tied up, full of sodium pentothal, and we asked them what was Iran going to do next, they wouldn't be able to tell us. Okay, because it's just not possible to know unless you know exactly what's in the head of the supreme leader. But it also is a system which, for exactly this set of reasons, it tends to incline the Iranians to inertia. And that's kind of, I think, the last point worth making on this particular issue, which is, Iranians speak about this all the time. Because the system is so big, so diverse, and because Khamenei is really the only man with the power to push the system, but he doesn't want to push the system because that would alienate different groups. It's a government that is very much based on inertia. And remember the kind of, go back to your 9th grade science, the actual law of inertia, which is a body at rest will remain at rest unless acted on by an outside force, and a body in motion will remain in motion unless acted on by an outside force. So in other words, it's very hard to get the Iranians to stop doing something that they are doing, and very hard to get them to start doing something that they haven't been doing, which is why I think it's going to be a real challenge to get them to change direction on the nuclear program.
Thank you. That was a very good summary in less than 3 minutes. We've talked about the different options, and you've spent most of your time talking about the military option and about containment. Several members of the audience asked, why shouldn't Iran have nuclear weapons? Why isn't that a viable option?
Sure. The short answer is because we and our allies don't trust them with them. That's the only answer. This is not an issue of principle. We could all say that we have a principle of nonproliferation, but let's face facts. The United States has been famously inconsistent in honoring that principle. We did nothing when the British and French acquired nuclear weapons. We actually protested pretty vociferously when the Israelis did. And actually, there's some really interesting scholarship now that talks about how President Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon all tried to get the Israelis to stop. But at the end of the day, they went their way, and the United States ultimately learned to live with it. We played games with the Pakistanis. We did a little bit with the Indians, and then ultimately came around to it. The real issue here is that we don't trust the Iranians, and our allies don't trust the Iranians, just as we don't trust the North Koreans, and our allies don't trust the North Koreans. The one thing that we've got going for us is that most of the rest of the world agrees with us. And one of the most important things that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years is that not just the United States, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Israel, all of our allies have said to the Iranians, you shouldn't be allowed to have nuclear weapons. But the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, all of them have also said very clearly in public and in private to the Iranians, we don't want you getting nuclear weapons either. And the Chinese in particular have been critical in applying the kind of sanctions that have been imposed on Iran because they've made it very clear they do not want Iran to have nuclear weapons.
Let me dig in a little deeper because so many audience members had variations on this question. And you say, rightfully, that most of the international community wouldn't trust Iran with nuclear weapons. My personal view is, and several of the audience members' view is, that that's not because they will actually use them, but we believe there might be leakage to terrorist organizations, and it might embolden Iran's other unfortunate activities. Hezbollah, supporting of extremist Shiite groups and sometimes extremist Sunni groups. Is that also what you believe, or is it more nuanced than that?
Absolutely. It's all of the above and a bunch of other stuff as well. And again, these are all topics I talk about very explicitly and in some length in the book. First point, I agree with exactly the way that you put it, Anya. I think the likelihood that Iran uses nuclear weapons unprovoked is extremely slight. And I think that's a very important thing to think about. Again, there's nothing out there that suggests that the Iranians are suicidal, crazy, messianic, any of those other things. What we've seen from the Iranians is actually, again, aggressive behavior, anti-status quo behavior, anti-social behavior, if you want to put it that way, but not recklessness. They've actually been quite prudent in the way that they've done things. I would actually put giving them to terrorists in the same category. I always like to point out the Iranians have been supporting terrorism since 1979, and they've had weapons of mass destruction since 1989. They've never seen fit to mix the two of them. Okay? And I think it's pretty clear why, and we've occasionally had Iranians say that, which is that they recognize that if anyone got hit by a terrorist group with weapons of mass destruction, that the Iranians don't believe that that country would follow the niceties of legal procedures and try to prove in a court of law that the Iranians were somehow behind it. That they'd get hit real fast and real hard. And therefore, they've never wanted to do that. It's also worth keeping in mind that the Iranians have a lot of experience with terrorists. And terrorists are, at the end of the day, very difficult to control. You give weapons of mass destruction to terrorists, you never know what they're going to do with them. And there's a long history of terrorist groups doing things that their sponsors actually didn't want them to do. So I think very good reasons why the Iranians wouldn't give nuclear weapons to terrorists. They won't have many. They've got much better ways to deliver them. And why on earth would you trust a terrorist group with what will ultimately be your crown jewels? But I see a number of other problems with Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And this is why it would be much better if the Iranians never do acquire nuclear weapons, why it would be much better for everybody that we never had to make this awful choice between containment or war. The point that you raised, I think, is a very important one, Anya, which is that it may embolden the Iranians to become far more aggressive at the unconventional level. Terrorism, support for insurgencies, efforts to subvert foreign governments. And I think that that is a very real problem. 10 years ago, when I wrote my first book on Iran called The Persian Puzzle, I talked about that and I called it the Pakistan problem. Because, of course, the Pakistanis got nuclear weapons for purely defensive purposes, but once they had them, they suddenly saw the world in a whole new light. And they suddenly became very aggressive and began mounting all kinds of dangerous terrorist operations against India, which led to the Kargil crisis. And there are a whole series of other issues as well. And again, I think that these are the problems of containment. It's just that, again, I think that they can be dealt with. And in my mind, none of them justifies the costs of a war.
Thank you. Now let's dig into another option that you raised, an ideal one from, I think, most of our perspective, which is a negotiated outcome. And a couple of sub-questions from the audience. One is, what is a must-have outcome? What are things that the U.S. cannot compromise on? And if you can go into a little more detail, slowing production, shutting down the enrichment process, how granular do you have to get here, and what exactly would they have to do as a baseline? And secondly, what carrots can we offer other than the ones that we offered in 03, 04, in 06, 07, again under the Obama administration, which is essentially a lifting of sanctions and reopening of economic ties?
Another great question. I'll try to do this fairly quickly because I think, again, they are absolutely critical issues. So first, the question of what do we need? What's the minimal that we need? What I would start with is actually inspections. Okay, I talk a lot about Iraq in the book and the lessons that we learned in Iraq. And the lessons we learned in Iraq run in all kinds of different directions. So it's actually important to kind of pay attention to them in their details. But what's, I think, very important to remember about Iraq is the inspections actually worked. We didn't realize it at the time, but Saddam did give up his weapons of mass destruction. Okay, it took him 6, 7 years, we don't really know, and he always planned to try to get them back, but he did give them up. Not because the inspections found everything. And remember, I was at CIA during this time, I was at the NSC, I was one of the guys trying to make the inspections work, and what we falsely believed all through that period was that you needed to find everything, or else Saddam would make progress with whatever he had left. And it turned out that that was exactly the wrong way to think about it. What Saddam cared about was ultimately the sanctions. And as long as the inspectors kept finding evidence that the Iraqis were cheating, the sanctions stayed on. And that's what caused Saddam to say, okay, I got to get rid of all of it so that they won't find anything. Okay? And so for me, the most important thing for a deal with Iran is they've got to accept Iraq-like sanctions. And what we talk about is the additional protocol plus. This is a codicil to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which would allow for Iraq-like inspections in countries like Iran. And the Iranians have actually agreed in principle to the additional protocol. They've never actually implemented it, though. So for me, that's where it's got to start. Beyond that, almost everything else is gravy. I would certainly look for a limit on how much the Iranians can enrich uranium. So I wouldn't go above 5%. No uranium enrichment beyond 5%. And since the Iranians seem ready to agree to that, that's an easy one. I'd also try to set limits on the amount of low-enriched uranium the Iranians could have in country. A lot of other people, and I think it's fair to try it, is to set limits on the number of centrifuges that the Iranians could have in country, all of which would make it that much harder for the Iranians to actually start enriching and build a bomb. But again, for me, the real thing that we must have are those unfettered inspections. That's what we didn't have in North Korea. That's why they were able to cheat and build a bomb. That's what we did have in Iraq after 91. That's why they couldn't. And then on this question of what can we give, a huge question, I'll just tick off a bunch of things. First, I think if just on the nuclear issue alone, we ought to be thinking more about provision of nuclear energy to the Iranians. The program they have now is not about nuclear energy. Okay, that is a complete nonsense. It is a weapons program. And again, in the book, I go through the different evidence for it. But they do have a legitimate need for energy. And I think that we ought to be ready to supply them with light water reactors to supply energy for them if they actually want it. I think that we ought to be ready to give them security guarantees, the way that we did Castro's Cuba after 1962 if they want that. I think that we ought to be willing to, if they want it, help them out with loans from the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. If they want to come into the WTO, that would be great. Then there's a whole series of other stuff which, again, we have other problems with the Iranians. It's not just their nuclear program. We have problems with them on terrorism. We have problems with them in terms of their opposition to a Middle East peace. If they were willing to talk about those things, I think there's a lot of other stuff that we can and should put on the table. Real economic and political and security benefits that we could give to them, not just taking away all the bad stuff that we've been inflicting on them.
Thank you. So that brings us to, if diplomacy fails, it brings us to your preferred, your least bad option, which is containment. And I'll just try to summarize a couple of different questions that the audience members had around that. One is, how do you actually implement containment? And as a part of that, how do you, and this is actually my question added on, how do you, are you containing just their nuclear program? Or are you also containing all the other bad activity that, frankly, is causing much more of a headache immediately for us, like their training of Assad's forces in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Again, great question. It's really the latter, or the last thing that you mentioned. We need to keep in mind, we have been containing Iran since 1979. And what's more, it's also important to note that the military option, as its proponents argue it could be implemented, isn't a substitute for containment, it's an adjunct to containment. Okay? Because the military option is about blowing up their nuclear program to make it easier to contain them, because they will simply be a conventional Iran, not a nuclear Iran. So nobody's talking about doing anything else. So what does containment look like? It looks very much like what we are doing now. Okay? And what is it all about? Well, go back to George Kennan and his formulation of containment about the Soviet Union. It is about preventing Iran from expanding beyond its borders, making mischief beyond its borders as best we can, until the internal contradictions of the regime bring about a transformation of the Iranian political system. And so it would mean continuing to do what we have always done, trying to prevent them from supporting terrorists, trying to prevent them from supporting insurgents, trying to prevent them from overthrowing governments friendly to us. It's all of the same stuff that we've been doing. And again, the only real path out of that is the path that Rouhani seems maybe to be offering to us. We've only got 3 real sets of policies out there. It's what we've always confronted. We either have good relations with the country, and we trade with them and have wonderful relations even when they fight with us like the French do, or we go to war with them and overthrow their government, or we contain them. Containment is what we do when we're not able to do the first and we're not willing to do the latter. And it's worth keeping in mind, just as a final point on this, that containment is a very flexible policy. I mean, think about how we contained the Soviet Union on the one hand, or Cuba on the one hand, very kind of loose containment, mostly just military containment, some sanctions, but not really trying to cripple them. I guess Cuba, we did cripple them. Compare that to what we did with Saddam Hussein. I mean, remember, our containment of Saddam Hussein included draconian sanctions, covert action, regular bombing campaigns against him. We were doing everything that we could to put a full court press on Iraq. And in the case of Iran, what I'd argue there is that what we need to be doing in the future, what we would do in the future if we can't get the deal and have a better relationship with them, is being flexible. At times we'll put more pressure on them, at times we'll put less pressure on them, depending on what they're doing, depending on what we think is going on in the world, maybe what's going on in the Middle East. But it's a very flexible approach to a very difficult problem.
That's good. Let me press you just a little further, and that is, I think it's an excellent answer on containment, but when you talk about containment in the Cold War, it often included things like covert operations. It included a huge effort to arm, for example, the Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s, and at times it involved a hot war, like in Vietnam, and other proxy wars and things like that. How far would you go here? Because I would argue that we are not currently containing Iran. For example, we're not pushing back on them really in Syria. We're not doing a massive amount to arm the Free Syrian Army or others who would push back.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Anya, although I'd make the point that if John McCain were president, which he might have been, we would be doing that. That would be part of containment of Iran. And at other points in time, we have done things like that. We took sides in the Lebanese civil war against the Iranians. We took sides in the Iraqi civil war against the Iranians. So we certainly have done those things. Could we do so in the future? Sure. It would depend on the circumstances. I certainly think that we would, at different points in time, we might want to try covert operations. We might want to mount cyber warfare operations, something we've been doing against them. We might want to arm the Iranian opposition. I certainly think that we ought to be doing more in terms of helping the legitimate, large-scale Iranian opposition to at least secure their own human rights, something I think that we failed miserably to do back in 2009 and to a certain extent ever since. But again, these are things that we can do more of, that we can do less of, depending on the circumstances. And again, in my mind, it's simply a continuation of how we have been handling Iran. The real issue is, do the nuclear weapons change anything? Do the nuclear weapons somehow make things different? And the answer is, of course, yes. It does introduce some different dynamics. Crisis management becomes very different and becomes much more important than it is with a non-nuclear Iran. Certainly they might become more aggressive in terms of their covert action. But what's always striking to me is that, first, we shouldn't make the Iranians out to be 10 feet tall. They've been trying for 34 years. They've never succeeded in overthrowing a foreign government. We've actually done a lot better at that than they have. Although, if they were willing to talk to us about our experiences with overthrowing governments, we might be able to convince them that it's actually not a great idea. But again, this is part of the problem of them and us not talking to each other. They've never been able to start a civil war. They've never been able to start an insurgency. All they do is when they find an existing situation, they try to get in there and they make things worse. And obviously that's not good. And I think that we can do a better job of pushing back on it. But again, in my mind, that doesn't justify the costs and risks of a war. Again, it is an issue that we have been dealing with, and we can do even better.
Great. One final question from the audience on containment, and that is, does containment continue even after they get a bomb?
Well, if we're not going to go to war with them and they're not willing to give up the bomb and make peace with us and have a rapprochement with us, yes, it would. And as I said, and nuclear Iran does change things, but I'll make point number one is I actually think there are a lot of things that we can do that will give us a very good chance of keeping them from crossing that last line and deploying the actual arsenal. Okay, I think there are a number of things that have kept them from doing so already. The Israelis will tell you they've had the capability since 2008 to actually get a bomb, and they've chosen not to. And they've chosen not to because they're afraid of 3 or 4 different things out there that I think they're afraid would happen if they crossed that line. And so I think that there are reasons to believe that we might be able to keep them from doing so even without an actual agreement with them. But if they do, again, there are a number of problems. And I think a number of people have raised the problems. And again, I try to deal with each one in the book. Crisis management, proliferation, another issue out there. Did the Saudis go ahead and get a nuclear weapon? That's an issue out there. We get into this issue of a more aggressive Iran, being more willing to employ terrorism and subversion that you raised. These are all issues out there. It's just as I work through them, and as I look at the experiences of the Cold War and other instances of containment, I tend to be more sanguine that we can deal with those situations and deal with it very adequately and to our advantage than I am about the risks that we will start to incur and the unknowns that we will begin to raise if we start down the path of force.
Thank you. You were one of the early and fairly prominent advocates of the use of force in Iraq a decade ago. Why do you think the situation now and here in Iran is so different?
A tough one, and again, something I try to deal with a lot in the book. In the case of Iraq, first, I don't know how many of you, if any of you, read my book. I will excuse any for not having read it. I think there are like 4 people who actually read it.
Everyone in Washington read it.
No, everyone in Washington read the subtitle. No one actually, and the index. No one read the book. But 3 of those people who did read it actually wrote wonderful reviews saying, boy, Pollack's argument is very different from the Bush administration's argument. And, in some ways, it is those differences that matter to me here. First, in the case of Iraq, look, I'm one of these liberal intervention guys. When I was in the Clinton administration, it just killed me that we couldn't do more in Rwanda, that we couldn't do more in Congo. I believed in our interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo. I believed in our intervention in Libya. And the plight of the Iraqi people, which was horrific, was part of my rationale. I will not defend the Iranian regime. They are odious. They do horrible things to their people. But it is not on the same level as what Saddam Hussein did. What Saddam did was orders of magnitude worse, with at least 1 million Iraqis killed as a result of his actions, with the horrors of the Anfal and Halabja, the draining of the marshes, one thing after another, the widespread use of torture. The second paired set of issues were the kind of WMD issues. So for me there, it was 2 things. It was the fact that our intelligence community, and let's remember, the intelligence communities of Britain, France, Germany, Israel, Russia, even Iran itself, who all believed that Saddam had reconstituted his weapons of mass destruction. I mean, in fact, as I think you know, Anya, when we invaded, all the Iraqis thought that they had weapons of mass destruction. Okay, only Saddam and maybe a few people around him realized that he had gotten rid of his weapons of mass destruction. So I listened to my friends back at CIA when they said he's got it. I believed them. But the critical additional piece, and the piece that I've been talking about tonight, was Saddam as a decision maker. My feeling is, I do believe, again, I talk about it in the book, that nuclear weapons are categorically different. Okay. Bernard Brody, back in 1946, wrote this wonderful book, The Absolute Weapon, in which he pointed out that nuclear weapons were so horrific that only a person who was truly stupid or insane could misunderstand what would happen if you started to use them. Well, what we know about Saddam now, what we thought we knew before then, as best we understood it, Saddam fell into that category. He had insane ideas about using nuclear weapons. And before the Iraq War, I would never say, Saddam, I would always say, we think Saddam is rational, he's just delusional, he has weird ideas about this. Now, some of the things that he did, some of the things that he thought about nuclear weapon, I think did border on actual madness. But the point is, back then, the way that Saddam conducted himself was so reckless, so aggressive, that it was suicidal, that it made him incredibly difficult to deter if he had those weapons of mass destruction. Now, of course, he didn't have those weapons of mass destruction. And I was wrong about that, as were our intelligence communities. And if you read this, you'll find I try very hard to learn from that lesson. But in the case of Iran, what's interesting to me is I think those 2 things are flipped. I think that the case is actually quite solid that the Iranians are developing a nuclear weapons capability. Although, again, I'm quite willing to believe that they're actually willing to stop short of building the weapons themselves. And again, I rehash all the different arguments and I lay out all the evidence in the book. But what we've seen with the Iranians is that they're not the same kind of reckless decision makers that Saddam is. Deterrence logic seems to work with Iran. In fact, I think all of the evidence makes very clear that it does work with Iran in a way that it didn't with Saddam. And so that says to me that, again, I'm willing to use force, but only if it's the last resort. In the case of Iraq, I believe that we were going to have to do it because I believed the intelligence community that he was 4 to 7 years away from having a nuclear weapon, and we could not let a man like Saddam Hussein have that capability. The Iranians are very different. As I said, if the North Koreans can behave themselves, the Iranians look like Canada by comparison. There is no reason to me that containment should not work with the Iranians as well.
Let me broaden it out to Israel, which we haven't talked about yet. And an audience member asks, what are the chances that Israel will just take care of the problem for us?
I love the way that you asked that. I don't know if that's how the questioner asked it, but I love the way that the question was phrased, because it allows me to say no. Okay. Now let me explain the answer. I think that there is some chance that Israel will strike Iran. Although, as I said in my remarks, and I'll unpack them a little bit, the Israelis have a military option. Okay? The Israeli military, as you all know, is extremely formidable. They are really good at using what they've got. And there's no question in my mind that if Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered it, the Israelis would go in there and they would blow up a bunch of stuff in Iran. Okay? The problem is that that's not going to be enough to actually take care of the problem. Okay? And this is the issue that the Israelis themselves confront. First, they do not have a military that is really fully capable of wiping out the entire Iranian military program. In particular, some of you may remember that when he was defense minister, Ehud Barak said that in the fall of 2012, Iran will enter a zone of immunity. And he said that because the Iranians were building a facility called Ferdo outside of their holy city of Qom, which was dug deep inside a mountain. For those of you who remember, NORAD headquarters down deep inside Cheyenne Mountain. That's what the Iranians did. Okay? And it is impervious to all of the weapons that the Israelis have in their arsenal. Okay? We're not sure we can take it out without using nuclear weapons, but we've got much bigger bombs than the Israelis do. Okay, so we think that there's some chance that we could. But the Israelis simply can't take out Ferdo. And if they can't take out Ferdo, they can't actually eliminate Iran's enrichment capability. And beyond that, there's sites out there, nobody knows where they are. The whole weaponization program is secret, nobody knows where it's located. Beyond that, again, the Israelis have all these different other problems that they have to deal with, which are even bigger for them than they were for us, as I described them. So as I said, the biggest thing is how do you keep the Iranians from rebuilding? If the Israelis strike them, again, I think there's very little doubt in anyone's mind. The Iranians will rebuild. They will withdraw from the NPT. If they withdraw from the NPT, that's the end of the inspectors, and it could also be the end of the sanctions, which means that it's easier for the Iranians to rebuild under those circumstances. And there's a whole set of problems that flow in addition to it that just make it really hard for the Israelis to actually take care of this problem, which is why they haven't struck. Okay, it's worth keeping in mind. The Israelis have been thinking about a strike on Iran at least since 1997. Okay, some of you may know, right after the Gulf War, they bought what was then the premier strike aircraft in the world from us, the F-15E. And we sold them to Israel as the F-15I, I for Israel. And all the Israeli pilots used to say to me, you say it's I for Israel, we say it's I for Iran. Because they bought these planes to strike Iran. You may have noticed they haven't done so. Okay? But Israel isn't a country like us. Okay? They don't believe in force being the last resort. They don't believe in exhausting all the other options. Okay? If they have a good military option, they take it immediately. It's their first resort. My guess is that there's no one in this room who had ever heard of the Osirak reactor before the Israelis blew it up in 1981. My guess is that there's no one in this room, maybe Anya, who had heard of Deir ez-Zor, where the Syrian reactor was, until the Israelis blew it up in 2007. Okay? When the Israelis have an option, a military option, they take it. And they certainly don't spend 16 years debating it in public, which I think is probably the best evidence of all that the Israelis know they do not have a great military option. And when you talk to Israeli leaders, as I get to do, but military, political, intelligence, the highest in the land, what they will say to you is our first priority, our goal, what we'd really like to have happen is we'd like to see a negotiated settlement that ends the Iranian nuclear threat. And if we can't get that, number 2 on our list is that you strike Iran, the United States, okay? And third on our list, like down here, is an Israeli military strike. And the best of them will say, don't make this our problem. We can't solve this problem. You guys have to solve this problem.
Thank you. In the minute or so that we have left, this is going to be a challenge. Let me try to
You gotta ask a
address
bad question.
the multitude of questions that we have on the region. And maybe I'll do my own summary and then get your take. So I've been doing a lot of press on Syria and get asked, why isn't chemicals, weapons the only issue? And I respond with something like this. The Syrian conflict is a problem on humanitarian grounds, because 100,000 people plus have died. It is a problem for our national interest because it is splitting the Middle East at its seams. It's dividing everything into Shia, Sunni lines. That's an oversimplification, but largely it is. It is allowing a massive resurgence of al-Qaeda, both in pockets of Syria and in Iraq. It is creating massive instability in Jordan, in Lebanon, and to a lesser degree in places like Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And our very intelligent audience ask questions along all these fronts. What do you see as being the biggest problem that Iran can cause on this front? And what can we do about it? In 30 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the biggest problem that Iran can create is simply continuing to do what they're doing, which is continuing to resupply the Assad regime. Because as long as Assad can get money and oil and spare parts and ammunition from the Iranians and the Russians and others, he will keep fighting. But I will just say, add one other, that a couple of weeks ago we did a big crisis simulation at Brookings on exactly this issue. And what was really fascinating there was the Iranian team deployed a contingent of Revolutionary Guards to Syria. And wow, did that ever screw up the American team.
That's right. Thank you very much.
Thank all of you.
For that excellent presentation. And I'd like to also thank the World Affairs Council for hosting you tonight and let the audience members know that Ken's excellent book is at the back of the room for sale. Thank you.